The world woke up to silence. That strange, suffocating kind of silence that follows shocking news before the chaos of reaction begins. It wasn't just another headline or social media trend. This was the story that would define the future of the British monarchy. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Buckingham Palace had confirmed what many had only whispered. King Charles III had chosen to step down. After years of duty, controversy, and emotional turmoil, an abdication date had been set. For the first time in living memory, a reigning monarch was voluntarily walking away from the throne. And his son, Prince William, had just broken that silence with a speech that shook not only Britain but the entire world. The words abdication and chaos appeared side by side across news tickers, each carrying centuries of royal weight. The United Kingdom has weathered wars, scandals, and divorces within the House of Windsor. But abdication? That word is a wound that still remembers 1936, when Edward VIII gave up his crown for love. Now, history seemed to repeat itself, though this time, love wasn't the cause, pain was. And in that pain stood Prince William, shoulders straight, jaw tight, voice trembling but resolute, as he delivered one of the most emotional public statements ever heard from a future king. 5 minutes ago, the palace press room went silent. William stepped up to the podium, his prepared remarks in hand, but his eyes revealed exhaustion. Not from lack of sleep, but from years of carrying the weight of family fractures, public scrutiny, and unspoken blame. Cameras flashed. Advisors held their breath. The moment felt like a fracture in time. He began slowly, each word deliberate, measured, as if he were trying to keep emotion from spilling over. The first few sentences spoke of duty, service, and the immense responsibility his father had carried since the day he ascended the throne. But as his tone shifted, something raw began to surface. "My father," he said, pausing to steady himself, "has borne burdens no one outside these walls could ever imagine. The toll of betrayal, division, and public ridicule has been heavier than any crown." There it was, the spark that ignited a firestorm of speculation. Within minutes, social media platforms exploded with interpretations. Was he referring to his brother and sister-in-law? Was this a public acknowledgement that the chaos within the royal family, much of it fueled by Harry and Meghan's actions, had driven the king to his breaking point? The tension was palpable. The cameras zoomed in on William's face, tired, haunted, but unflinchingly composed. His expression told 1,000 stories. Of a son who had watched his father age decades in just a few years, of a brother who once shared laughter and now shared nothing but silence, and of a man torn between love for his family and loyalty to the institution that defines him. "The monarchy," he continued, "is not just a symbol, it is a living promise, and that promise has been tested beyond measure." As those words hung in the air, the room seemed to contract around him. Every journalist present knew what he was implying. The wounds left by the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, the interviews, the accusations, the revelations, had not healed. If anything, they had festered beneath the polished veneer of royal appearances. And now, with the king's abdication set, the price of those wounds had finally come due. Outside the palace, the crowd that had gathered hours before the announcement was a sea of confusion. Some cried openly. Others shouted questions toward the gates, as if the iron bars might answer them. "Why now?" one woman asked, her voice breaking. "He waited his whole life for the throne. Why would he give it up?" But inside the palace walls, everyone already knew the answer. The king's health had weakened, his spirit even more so. Years of public pressure, unending media scrutiny, and relentless family divisions had worn him thin. And perhaps most painful of all was watching the two sons he loved drift so far apart that no official statement or private meeting could bridge the distance anymore. In private, sources close to the family spoke of countless late-night calls between Charles and William, conversations filled with uncertainty and regret. William had begged his father not to make this decision yet, not to surrender the crown under the weight of gossip and grief. But Charles, ever the emotional monarch, had made up his mind. The throne must be led by someone whose strength is not divided by sorrow, he reportedly told his eldest son. When the abdication date was set and the official paperwork signed, a new kind of reality began to dawn. William was no longer the heir waiting patiently in line. He was the next king of England in waiting, but under circumstances no one could have imagined. And though his title would rise, the cost of that ascent was heavy. A father stepping down, a brother estranged, and a monarchy fractured under the glare of modern scandal. William's speech wasn't meant to assign blame, but his emotions betrayed him. When families fracture, he said, his voice tightening, the whole world sees our pain, but it is not the cameras that wound us most. It is betrayal. The silence that followed that word was deafening. Even seasoned royal correspondents hesitated to breathe. The young prince had crossed an invisible line, one that royal tradition rarely allowed. He had spoken from the heart, and in doing so, he had indirectly confirmed what millions had speculated for years, that the bitterness between the Waleses and the Sussexes wasn't just tabloid fantasy. It was real, it was raw, and it had consequences that reached all the way to the throne. In living rooms across Britain, televisions flickered as families watched in stunned silence. Grandmothers who had watched the coronation just 2 years earlier whispered prayers for the royal family. Younger viewers scrolled through Twitter threads dissecting every frame of William's expression. Internationally, news anchors interrupted regular programming. Breaking news out of London, they said, their voices urgent. Prince William delivers a deeply emotional speech following King Charles's abdication, appearing to blame his brother and Meghan Markle for the turmoil within the royal family. The middle of this story is where the truth begins to unravel. Behind every carefully crafted royal statement lies a labyrinth of emotions and politics. William's words, though polished, came from a place of exhaustion. He had spent years defending his family's image while enduring relentless public comparison with his brother. The heir and the spare dynamic, once an affectionate royal cliché, had become a wound that refused to heal. Meghan's arrival had deepened that divide, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. Independence, rebellion, and a challenge to the centuries-old hierarchy that William had been born to uphold. Privately, William had often expressed that he wanted to protect his father's legacy, to be a stabilizing force. Yet now, as he stood before the world, that very legacy seemed to be slipping through his fingers. His speech was as much an appeal as it was a warning, a plea for unity, a call for reflection, and perhaps a subtle message to his brother across the Atlantic. Look what we've lost. As the applause began, hesitant, restrained, more respectful than celebratory, William's eyes glistened for a moment before he turned away from the podium. He didn't linger. He didn't shake hands. He simply walked off the stage, leaving behind a storm of unanswered questions. In the hours that followed, Buckingham Palace's phone lines were jammed with media requests. Officials declined to comment on whether William's remarks were reviewed or approved beforehand. Inside sources claimed his team had urged him to keep the tone strictly formal, but William had insisted on adding personal lines. He wanted to speak as a son, one aide said, not just as a prince. That distinction mattered. For in those brief few minutes, William wasn't the royal heir or the poised public figure. He was a man who had watched his family disintegrate in slow motion, and whose father, once the steadfast symbol of continuity, had chosen to walk away rather than continue watching the monarchy tear itself apart. By evening, the palace gates glowed beneath the soft light of camera flashes. Crowds still lingered, clutching flags and photographs of the king. The sound of church bells in the distance mixed with the low murmur of disbelief. In pubs across London, conversations circled around the same questions. Why now? What really pushed Charles to this decision? And could William ever forgive those he blamed? The introduction to this story ends not with resolution but with a question that cuts deep. When a monarchy built on image and tradition begins to fracture under emotion and truth, who is left to hold it together? Prince William's speech may have been the first sign of healing, or the final confirmation that the wounds have gone too deep. He had begun his statement as a son honoring his father, but he ended it as a leader stepping into the eye of a storm, one that began years ago when his brother walked away and may not end until the monarchy itself is forever changed. He left the podium, but his words stayed behind, echoing through the corridors of Buckingham Palace like a prophecy. That duty without unity is fragile, that truth without forgiveness is poison, and that sometimes, even a prince must break to rebuild what was lost. Buckingham Palace had seen its fair share of breaking news over the centuries. Announcements of births, engagements, funerals, and coronations, but never had it felt as heavy as it did on this gray morning. The world outside its black iron gates had gone still, as if holding its breath, waiting for confirmation of what had been whispered for days. The abdication date had been set. Inside the press office, the weight of history pressed down on every wall, and the usual polished calm of the palace staff was replaced by something more human. Uncertainty, dread, even disbelief. The announcement would go out at precisely 11 a.m., the time chosen to allow news networks around the world to synchronize their live broadcasts. Every word of the statement had been revised, rehearsed, and approved by senior aides and the king himself, yet as the moment approached, everyone in the room seemed to know that no amount of official phrasing could soften the impact of what was about to happen. Outside, a drizzle had started to fall, streaking the gold trim of the palace gates and pooling along the pavement where crowds had already gathered since dawn. Tourists clutched umbrellas, journalists held cameras under rain hoods, and royal watchers from across the country stood shoulder to shoulder, murmuring in disbelief. Some had camped overnight, hoping to glimpse a familiar face or catch a glimpse of the royal standard fluttering overhead. The mood was uncertain, oscillating between respect and confusion. For years, King Charles had been portrayed as the patient son who waited decades for his chance to reign. And now, after barely 2 years on the throne, he was stepping down. The reasons given were simple: health and personal well-being. But everyone knew there was more to it than that. The palace gates, normally symbols of majesty and order, now stood like silent witnesses to a family unraveling under the public gaze. Behind them, in one of the offices overlooking the courtyard, a group of staffers watched the television screens mounted on the wall. Each channel displayed the same breaking news banner: Buckingham Palace announces abdication date. The words looked unreal, like a headline from another era. One aide whispered that she had never seen the palace press corps so tense, not even after Queen Elizabeth's passing. Another said she could feel the ghost of history lingering in the corridors, the echo of 1936, when Edward VIII's abdication had sent shockwaves through the empire. When the palace's official spokesperson finally stepped before the cameras, the world seemed to stop moving. He was composed, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. "It is with deep respect and humility," he began, "that His Majesty King Charles III has informed the Prime Minister and the Privy Council of his intention to abdicate the throne, effective this December." The statement continued, outlining the constitutional formalities, but those words faded into the background. The shock came not from the legal details but from the reality that it was over, that the man who had waited nearly a lifetime for the crown had chosen to relinquish it. The question on everyone's lips wasn't just why now, but what finally broke him. Inside the palace, whispers grew louder. Some said it was his health. Others claimed it was the unrelenting pressure of public opinion. But those who had seen him behind closed doors knew that this was about more than exhaustion or illness. It was about disillusionment. Charles had inherited a monarchy already weakened by internal division, media intrusion, and the growing cynicism of a modern audience. Every scandal, every headline, every family dispute had chipped away at the foundation of the institution he had sworn to uphold. The strain between his sons, once his greatest sorrow, had become an open wound he could no longer conceal. The official statement avoided any mention of family tension, but palace insiders couldn't ignore the truth. The king's greatest heartbreak had been watching his family become a battlefield. Those who had served him longest spoke quietly about the change they had seen over the past year. He smiled less, spoke less, and often retreated into private reflection after public engagements. Once, he had been a man of ideas, passionate about the environment, architecture, and art. Lately, he had seemed like a man haunted by his own lineage, trapped between legacy and failure. One aide recounted that after a recent engagement, the king had whispered, "I never imagined it would end like this." As news spread across the nation, television screens flickered with images of black cars leaving the palace. Reporters speculated on who was inside: royal advisors, ministers, family members. The BBC interrupted its regular programming, switching to live commentary from outside Buckingham Palace. "We are witnessing an extraordinary moment in modern British history," the anchor said solemnly. "For the first time in nearly 90 years, a monarch has chosen to step aside voluntarily." Commentators spoke in hushed tones about what this meant for the monarchy's future. Some saw it as a dignified act of self-awareness, others as a sign of weakness. But beneath the surface of every broadcast was the same undertone of disbelief. The monarchy, that ancient and enduring symbol of stability, suddenly seemed fragile. Across the country, reactions varied. In London, crowds stood in quiet clusters outside pubs where televisions played the news on loop. In Manchester and Birmingham, radio hosts invited callers to share their thoughts. An elderly woman broke down on air, saying, "He was never given peace. From the day he married Diana, the world never stopped judging him." Another caller, younger and more skeptical, said, "It's not about peace. It's about responsibility. He gave up." The split in public opinion mirrored the deeper divide within the royal family itself, an unspoken fracture that had widened with every passing year. At the same time, news outlets overseas picked up the story. American morning shows framed it as a royal crisis, while European headlines used words like turmoil, sacrifice, and betrayal. In Australia, commentators drew parallels between Charles's struggles and the growing disinterest of younger generations in royal tradition. "The monarchy has always relied on its ability to adapt," one analyst said. "But adaptation has turned into survival mode." Each new perspective added to the noise, but none could escape the same haunting question: what or who had driven the king to this decision? As speculation mounted, all eyes turned toward the next generation. Prince William was now the immediate heir. His face, once a symbol of renewal and modernity, now carried the burden of succession under a cloud of family pain. When he appeared later that day to deliver his remarks, the contrast between the calm formality of the announcement and the raw emotion of his speech was striking. The official tone of the palace statement had spoken of continuity and duty. William's speech spoke of heartbreak and consequence. Between those two narratives lay the truth. The monarchy wasn't merely transitioning. It was fracturing. Back inside Buckingham Palace, courtiers went about their duties with quiet precision. Press officers fielded calls, private secretaries organized schedules, and security staff monitored the growing crowd outside. Yet beneath the routine, a strange melancholy had settled in. The palace had always operated like a machine, built to weather any storm through order and protocol. But now, even the rhythm of daily life seemed disrupted. The hallways felt colder, the air heavier. A staff member who had served since the Queen's reign said softly, "When Her Majesty passed, it was sorrow. Today it feels like loss." The official documents confirming the King's abdication were to be sealed that evening, with the Privy Council meeting to formalize the process. Behind closed doors, William met with senior advisors, including the Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury, to discuss the transition. The conversation was brief but loaded with significance. William had insisted that his father's legacy be honored with dignity and that the narrative not be tainted by scandal. "No more divisions," he reportedly said, though his tone carried more hope than certainty. While the palace worked to maintain composure, the press dissected every line of the statement. The phrase, "effective this December," became a point of obsession. Why December? Why not immediately? Analysts speculated that the timing was deliberate, a final symbolic gesture that would allow Charles to close the year as king, leaving the new reign to begin in January, a clean start for a new era. Some saw it as poetic, others as tragic. Either way, it marked the end of a story that had taken 74 years to write. By late afternoon, the light had dimmed over London, but the media frenzy showed no signs of slowing. The palace gates remained crowded, and the occasional shout of "God save the king" broke through the steady hum of reporters. Inside, the king was said to be resting, having spent the morning in private reflection with Queen Camilla. According to one source, he had asked for no visitors and had turned off his phone. The image of the king alone in his study, surrounded by portraits of his ancestors, summed up the mood of the nation. A monarch facing the end of his reign, haunted by the weight of his choices and the family fractures that had defined them. As the news cycle continued, public sympathy began to mingle with resentment. The idea that personal conflicts had influenced the king's decision struck a nerve. For many, the monarchy had always symbolized endurance, a quiet continuity above the noise of politics and media. Now, it seemed even that ideal had crumbled. Every mention of Harry and Meghan reignited debates over responsibility and blame. "This is what happens when family matters become public entertainment," one commentator said. The institution wasn't built to survive personal wars fought in the global spotlight. As night fell, Buckingham Palace stood illuminated, its facade glowing softly against the dark sky. Cameras remained trained on its gates, waiting for any sign of movement. Inside, Prince William sat in a quiet room, his father's statement lying folded on the table before him. He didn't need to read it again, he had memorized every line. Outside, London continued to hum, unaware that in that still moment, the future of the monarchy had already begun to shift. The announcement had been made, the die had been cast, and nothing could reverse it. But as the palace returned to uneasy silence, one truth lingered in the minds of all who served within its walls. The words may have been formal, the tone composed, but beneath the polished language lay a simple human reality. This abdication wasn't about politics or duty. It was about heartbreak. And heartbreak, unlike tradition, doesn't fade easily. The night before the official announcement, Buckingham Palace was a fortress of quiet tension. The grand windows glowed dimly against the London skyline, and behind those walls, the final act of a long and weary reign was unfolding in private. King Charles sat alone in his study, the same room where he had once watched his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, prepare her Christmas broadcasts. The clock ticked softly, marking the end of a chapter he had spent his whole life preparing for, and perhaps the one he was least ready to face. The papers lay neatly stacked on the mahogany desk before him, their legal wording clear, but their meaning heavy beyond measure. Abdication. It wasn't just a royal decision, it was a surrender of destiny, a relinquishing of identity. The king's spectacles rested beside him, untouched for several minutes, as he stared blankly at the parchment that would change everything. He had signed countless documents in his life, proclamations, policies, state agreements, but this one seemed to defy his hand. Outside his door, the palace staff waited for his final confirmation. The private secretary had been instructed to prepare 2 drafts, one announcing that His Majesty would temporarily scale back engagements, and another confirming his abdication outright. For days, Charles had wavered between the two, torn by duty and despair. But in the final hours of that long evening, something within him broke. Not in anger, but in resignation. His health had been a convenient excuse for the public, but those who truly knew him understood that this decision ran deeper. It was about the exhaustion of carrying a crown that had come too late and too heavy. The years of criticism, the constant comparisons to his mother, and the invisible weight of family division had left him hollow. What was a throne worth when peace within one's own family had become impossible? Sources close to the palace later described a haunting stillness in the corridors that night. The king had dismissed his aides and asked for privacy. Only Queen Camilla remained by his side, her presence quiet but steady. She had seen his struggle for months, had watched him wrestle between pride and sorrow, and knew that by morning, his decision would be final. "You've done all you can," she reportedly told him. "It's time to let peace find you." But peace was an illusion. Even as the king sought relief in abdication, he knew the storm that would follow. There would be headlines, public outrage, political debate, and, most painfully, speculation about the real reason behind his choice. The blame would fall somewhere, and he knew exactly where the public's eyes would turn: to his sons. The rift between William and Harry had not only divided their family, it had weakened the moral foundation of the monarchy itself. What began as private discontent had grown into global spectacle, every interview and memoir feeding a media frenzy that refused to die. Charles had tried, in his own reserved way, to reconcile them. He had hosted private meetings, written letters, even extended invitations that were ignored. But with each passing year, hope had eroded. And now, even the king's authority could not mend what time and pride had broken. Insiders said the final straw came weeks earlier, during a quiet evening at Sandringham. The king had reportedly received a private message from an American contact close to the Sussexes. It contained an upcoming media segment about new revelations tied to the monarchy, something that promised to reopen old wounds. It wasn't the first time such news had reached him, but this time, it arrived on the same day as troubling updates from his doctors. That night, those closest to him saw the spark of resignation in his eyes. He realized, said one aide, that his reign had become a battlefield, not a legacy. When morning came, the king walked slowly into his private chapel. The light from the stained glass windows bathed the room in soft color, illuminating his lined face as he knelt in silence. Those who saw him described him as calm, even serene, but his eyes were swollen from a sleepless night. For half an hour he prayed, perhaps for forgiveness, perhaps for guidance. When he rose, he asked to see his eldest son. Prince William arrived an hour later, dressed in a dark suit, the weight of anticipation evident on his face. He had known this moment might come, but not so soon. Father and son spoke privately for nearly 40 minutes. No one else was in the room, and no official record was kept, but what little has been shared by sources paints a portrait of heartbreak. Charles reportedly told his son, "I cannot hold it together any longer, William. The throne is not worth the destruction of the family." William, according to those briefed, had tried to reason with him. He spoke of duty, of legacy, of their mother's memory. But Charles's resolve was unshakable. He spoke softly, almost as though comforting himself. "History will not remember how long I reigned. It will remember whether I left it standing." By the end of that conversation, William understood. His father wasn't quitting, he was escaping. Escaping the endless criticism, the divisions, the emotional exhaustion that came from watching his sons drift apart. The monarchy had survived wars, scandals, and revolutions, but it had never faced an age where the royal family itself had become entertainment for the world's stage. That evening, Charles retreated once more to his study. There, under the low hum of the desk lamp, he picked up his pen and signed his name. It was done. The abdication papers were finalized. History had been rewritten in a single stroke. Elsewhere in the palace, silence fell as word spread among the inner staff. Some cried quietly. Others stood frozen in disbelief. The air was thick with emotion. Grief, relief, and uncertainty all at once. In one corner of the private hallway, an elderly butler who had served both Charles and his mother whispered, "I never thought I'd see this day." Across London, a small circle of senior advisors gathered in the cabinet office to discuss logistics. The constitutional steps were clear, but the emotional ramifications were not. The Prime Minister was notified, followed by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The announcement would go public within 48 hours. Even before the official statement, rumors had begun to swirl across the press. Reporters had noticed unusual movements around the palace, extra security, extended meetings, and the sudden absence of the king from scheduled events. By midnight, social media was awash with speculation. "Something big is coming," one journalist tweeted. They were right. The following morning, the king awoke to the sound of distant church bells. For the first time in decades, there was no schedule waiting for him, no briefing papers, no agenda filled with royal obligations. It was as if the monarchy itself had exhaled. But beneath that momentary calm lay a deeper ache, one that no abdication could heal. The price of stepping down wasn't just the crown. It was the weight of public judgment and private guilt. In the days leading up to the public announcement, those closest to the family noticed an unusual quiet between William and his father. They spoke, but only briefly. There were no long phone calls, no shared dinners. Both men were preparing for what came next, one to relinquish power, the other to inherit it. William spent hours reviewing drafts of his upcoming speech, trying to find the balance between respect and reality. He wanted to honor his father's decision but also make clear that the monarchy still stood. But deep down, anger simmered. He had spent his entire life preparing for this role, but not under these circumstances. Becoming king was meant to be an eventual transition, not a sudden crisis born from chaos. And though he would never admit it publicly, he knew the tension with his brother and Meghan had played a part in all of this. He had watched as their actions, whether intentional or not, had eroded his father's peace of mind. Each new interview, each accusation, had chipped away at the king's confidence. William didn't need to name them in his speech. The world already knew who he meant when he spoke of division. As the abdication date neared, palace insiders described the atmosphere as eerily calm. Meetings continued, letters were exchanged, and officials rehearsed the ceremonial procedures. But beneath the polished protocol was an unspoken sadness. Every staff member understood that they were witnessing something that would be studied in history books for generations. The last abdication had been for love. This one was for survival. On the eve of the public announcement, the king took one final walk through the palace gardens. It was dusk, and the fading light brushed the gravel paths with soft gold. He paused near the statue of his mother and whispered something no one else heard. Then he turned back toward the palace, his steps slow but steady, his decision sealed by time and consequence. When the announcement finally reached the world, it came as a shock to the public but as a relief to the man who had carried its burden. For Charles, the throne had never been a gift. It had been a responsibility that demanded everything and gave little in return. Now, with his decision made, the monarchy was no longer his to protect. It was William's. But even as the ink dried and the statements went live, those who truly understood the heart of this story knew the truth. Abdication had not freed the king. It had exposed the family's deepest wounds. It was the culmination of years of quiet suffering, unspoken betrayal, and relentless pressure. Behind the grandeur of ceremony lay a simple human truth. The king had finally reached the point where duty could no longer outweigh heartbreak. And as the cameras flashed and headlines spread, a quiet question hung in the air. Had the crown itself become too heavy for anyone to bear? Prince William stood in the dimly lit corridor outside the royal briefing room, his reflection faintly visible in the polished wood panels. The murmur of reporters waiting beyond the palace gates was a dull hum that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. In a few moments, he would step forward and face not only the nation but the weight of his own family's history. He knew what was expected of him, to project calm, dignity, and unity. But beneath the surface, a storm churned. This was not just another royal address. This was the moment when he would have to speak for a monarchy fractured by pain, overshadowed by scandal and shaken to its core. The press had already begun their countdown. The world was watching. The king's abdication had just been confirmed, and it fell to William to steady the ship before it sank beneath the waves of speculation. His father's health had been the official reason, but William knew better. Everyone inside the palace knew better. The truth was not illness, it was exhaustion. It was heartbreak, It was the slow disintegration of trust that had begun years ago and never truly healed. When the clock struck noon, the doors opened, and William walked in. The cameras clicked in a frenzy, flashes bouncing off the marble walls. He paused briefly at the podium, his expression neutral but his eyes heavy with emotion. The air felt thick, electric, charged with anticipation. The journalists in the front row sat upright, pens poised, recorders blinking red. Everyone waited for the first words. "My father," William began quietly, "has carried the crown with devotion and humility. Today, as he steps back from the duties that have defined his life, I stand before you not only as his son, but as someone who has witnessed firsthand the toll that public life can take on those who serve." The silence that followed was absolute. Every camera zoomed in on his face. Every journalist caught the tremor in his voice. He continued, choosing his words carefully, each one edged with sincerity and pain. "His Majesty has given more than the public will ever know." Behind the ceremonies, behind the smiles and the waving crowds, there has been a man who has endured more scrutiny, more criticism, and more betrayal than any monarch of this age should. Those last words, betrayal and endured, hung in the air like storm clouds. Within seconds, phones vibrated in the journalists' laps as messages and live tweets exploded across the internet. Some analysts leaned forward, whispering to each other. Was he referring to the family divisions? To the relentless tabloid battles? Or was it a veiled reference to the transatlantic rift with Harry and Meghan that had fractured the royal image beyond repair? William paused, glancing down briefly at his notes before setting them aside completely. What came next wasn't scripted. "There are wounds," he said, his tone tightening, "that are not visible to the public, wounds that come from words spoken in anger, from trust broken in the glare of the world's attention. And those wounds take time to heal. Some may never heal at all." He didn't name names, but he didn't need to. Every viewer, every journalist, every royal correspondent knew exactly whom he meant. Across the Atlantic, the clip would soon play on American morning shows with headlines like "William's emotional speech hints at family betrayal" and "Future King blames internal divisions for Charles's abdication." As William spoke, the audience in the room seemed to lean in closer. His voice grew firmer now, tinged with something raw, disappointment, perhaps even anger. "My father has chosen peace over power, and though it breaks my heart to see him step down, I understand why. The constant turmoil, the lack of unity, the endless speculation. It has taken from him something no title could ever restore." A reporter in the second row whispered to a colleague, "He's talking about Harry." The colleague nodded but kept her eyes fixed on William. She'd covered the royals for 20 years and had never seen him like this. Not this open, not this emotional. He took a breath and pressed on. When families fracture in public, it's easy for the world to choose sides. But those of us living through it don't have that luxury. We feel every headline like a cut. We carry every misunderstanding like a weight. He hesitated, then added quietly, "And sometimes, those closest to us are the ones who hurt us most." The words struck like a thunderclap. Cameras captured the moment in sharp detail. His clenched jaw, his eyes glistening with restrained emotion. Somewhere in California, someone would watch that clip and know exactly what he meant. After a long pause, William's voice softened. "But my father has taught me one thing above all else, that leadership is not measured by how long one reigns, but by the grace with which one lets go. Today, he lets go not in defeat, but in love, for his family, for his country, and for the crown that has defined his existence." A slow murmur moved through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, the clicks of cameras growing quieter as everyone realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. A prince not hiding behind protocol, but speaking from the heart. Then came the part that truly stunned the nation. William's tone shifted again, steady but sharper, more deliberate. "The crown is not a shield against chaos," he said. "It is a promise to endure, to serve, and to forgive. And if that promise has been broken by any of us, it is our duty to mend it, not to run from it." The implication was undeniable. In those few lines, he had not only addressed the monarchy's internal turmoil, but had subtly called out the actions that had contributed to it. His words carried a message of accountability wrapped in dignity, a balancing act that few could manage, but one that William executed flawlessly. As he neared the end of his address, the room grew colder. The gravity of the moment was suffocating. My father's abdication marks not the end of a reign, but the beginning of reflection, he said. We must learn from what has been lost. We must rebuild what has been broken. And above all, we must remember that service means putting unity before self. He closed his notes, looked up, and delivered his final line with a quiet conviction that would be replayed on every screen for days to come. The monarchy is not a single man's burden. It is a shared responsibility, and I intend to carry it with both humility and resolve. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, as he turned to leave the podium, the room erupted in applause. Not the cheerful kind reserved for royal weddings or jubilees, but the subdued, heavy applause that follows something deeply human. Outside the palace, the crowd that had gathered erupted into cheers and tears simultaneously. Some waved flags. Others stood in stunned silence. The contrast was striking. Inside, a man had just carried the weight of centuries. Outside, a nation was trying to process what it meant. That night, news outlets replayed his speech in full. Analysts dissected every phrase, every gesture, every flicker of emotion. Body language experts noted the way his hands trembled slightly when he spoke of betrayal, the tightening of his throat when he mentioned forgiveness. Social media exploded with reactions, some praising his honesty, others accusing him of deepening the divide by speaking too candidly. But regardless of opinion, everyone agreed on one thing. This was the most emotional royal speech since the Queen's broadcast after Diana's death. Behind closed doors, however, William sat alone in his private office, the adrenaline fading into exhaustion. Catherine entered quietly, her face pale but composed. She placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "You said what needed to be said." He nodded but didn't respond. The weight of his words still lingered, and he knew their consequences would ripple far beyond that moment. In the coming days, editorials would call it a defining moment, a royal reckoning, and even William's declaration of independence. But to the man himself, it had been something simpler and far more personal. A son's plea for peace, a leader's promise to restore what had been lost. For the royal family, the days following were chaos disguised as order. Every official engagement became a minefield of questions. Senior courtiers scrambled to project unity while quietly managing fallout. Behind the scenes, communications advisors drafted statements not to release but to keep ready, just in case the Sussexes responded publicly. The worst thing that could happen now, one aide said, is escalation. But escalation was already underway. Private sources revealed that William's words had reignited long-dormant resentments within the extended family. Some praised his courage. Others thought it reckless. One senior royal reportedly muttered, "He's the heir. He must be careful with his truths." But William had passed the point of politeness. In his mind, silence had enabled the very chaos that had consumed his father. Speaking out wasn't rebellion, it was cleansing. He had long believed that certain people within the family had traded loyalty for attention, duty for narrative. They wanted freedom, he told a confidant. But freedom came at a price, and my father is paying it. The implication was unmistakable. Harry and Meghan's decision to step back, to build a life outside royal protocol, had not only divided the family emotionally, but weakened its moral authority. The institution, already fragile after decades of scandals, could not bear another public fracture. Yet here they were, a monarchy turned inside out, exposed by its own. Behind closed doors, aides described the prince as distant in the days after his speech. He kept busy, attending meetings, reviewing transition documents for the coming change in leadership. But those who saw him privately said he seemed weighed down. Catherine tried to lift his spirits, reminding him that speaking from the heart had been the right thing to do. But William knew words had consequences, and his could not be taken back. The press coverage only intensified his internal struggle. Editorials ranged from admiration to condemnation. The Times called it a rare moment of honesty in royal history. The Daily Mail accused him of turning grief into grievance. The Guardian described it as a young man trying to salvage dignity from ruins. Meanwhile, public opinion polls shifted dramatically. Sympathy for King Charles surged, but trust in the monarchy as an institution dipped slightly. The public seemed to sense the human pain behind the headlines. "It's heartbreaking," said one London woman interviewed outside Westminster. "You can feel his love for his father, and his anger toward what's been lost." Abroad, reactions were just as emotional. In the United States, the coverage was more personal than political. Talk shows debated whether William's speech was a veiled attack or a cry for reconciliation. Some commentators defended Harry and Meghan, insisting the monarchy's rigidity had driven them away. Others argued that William's loyalty to duty had made him the true heir in spirit as well as name. The story became less about the throne and more about the family behind it. Within Buckingham Palace, however, there was no time for sentiment. Meetings stretched late into the night as preparations began for the transition. The king's abdication ceremony would need to be organized with precision, and the public narrative carefully controlled. But in every briefing, one topic kept resurfacing: how to manage the fallout from William's speech. Every advisor had an opinion, but none had a solution. "We cannot unsay what has been said," one remarked. "We can only shape what comes next." And what came next would depend on whether the prince's words built bridges or burned them. Late one evening, William sat alone in his private residence, a single light illuminating his desk. The notes from his speech were still there, edges crumpled, the ink slightly smudged. He read over them again, lingering on one line: "The crown is a promise to forgive." He wondered if he truly believed it. Forgiveness was a noble idea, but could he offer it to those who, in his mind, had torn his family apart? Somewhere in the distance, Big Ben chimed midnight. The sound echoed through the London night, a reminder that time moves forward, even when hearts remain stuck in the past. The following morning, a new headline swept across British media: Prince William's hidden message to his brother. The article, citing anonymous palace insiders, claimed that the speech was meant not to condemn but to challenge, to force Harry to confront the damage his actions had caused. "He's not closing the door," one insider said. "He's daring his brother to walk through it." But whether Harry ever would remained uncertain. Sources close to him said he was torn, angered by the implication, yet touched by the vulnerability behind the words. Meghan, however, was reportedly furious. "He's blaming us for the king's decision," she told a friend. "That's not fair." In the quiet moments between duty and reflection, William's thoughts returned again and again to his father. He pictured him alone in his study, the weight of the crown finally lifted but the scars of leadership still visible. He thought of how much had been lost. Not just titles or duties, but laughter, trust, family dinners that no longer existed. "They turned my family against itself." The phrase echoed in his mind like a refrain, one he both regretted and believed. As preparations continued for the abdication ceremony, the world focused on logistics, dates, venues, protocol. But beneath all the formalities, the true story simmered quietly. A son's grief, a father's surrender, a family divided by love and legacy. The speech had ended, but its impact had just begun. And in the spaces between applause and silence, between duty and resentment, one truth remained. Forgiveness may heal nations, but within a family, it takes more than words. It takes a willingness to face the pain that those words reveal. Across the ocean in Montecito, the California morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows of the Sussex residence, spilling across the marble floors like liquid gold. The world outside was still waking up, but inside the house, the tension was already palpable. Meghan sat at the edge of the breakfast table, a tablet in her hand, the volume turned low but the captions running in real time. On the screen was Prince William, standing at the palace podium, every word echoing through her chest. She had watched the speech once already. Now she was watching it again. Not as a spectator, but as someone listening for intent. For accusation. Harry entered the room quietly, his eyes tired from a sleepless night. He didn't need to ask what she was watching. The same image had been everywhere since the early hours. British networks, American talk shows, Twitter feeds lit up with clips from the speech that was being called the most emotional royal address of the decade. Meghan looked up at him, her jaw tight. "He's blaming us," she said. "Not outright, but everyone knows who he means." Her voice carried a low tremor, the sound of someone oscillating between indignation and disbelief. Harry rubbed his face, exhaling slowly. "He didn't say our names." "He didn't have to," she replied, turning the tablet so the paused frame faced him. William's expression was frozen mid-sentence, eyes narrowed in earnest conviction. "Look at him. That's not just sorrow, Harry. That's judgment." He watched for a moment, silent. In another life, the sight of his brother on a global broadcast might have filled him with pride. But now it only stirred unease. He remembered their last private meeting, short, tense, filled with the kind of politeness that hides disappointment. There had been no reconciliation, only the widening recognition that they no longer spoke the same language. Across social media, the speech had already divided the world. British outlets hailed William as dignified and restrained, the heir who spoke from the heart. American commentators were more divided. Some called it an unnecessary provocation, while others framed it as an unavoidable reckoning. Everyone had an opinion. Few knew the truth. For Meghan and Harry, the truth was far less cinematic. It was weariness. It was the ache of being perpetually misunderstood. Meghan scrolled through online comments under the video, her lips tightening as she read the words aloud. "They destroyed the family. They made Charles quit. They'll never be forgiven." She dropped the tablet onto the table. "It's disgusting." Harry looked away. The media was always going to twist it. "It's not just the media anymore," she said softly. "It's him." She had seen William's face countless times over the years, smiling at charity events, laughing during royal engagements, polite and distant during state occasions. But she had never seen him like this. The sorrow was genuine, but beneath it, she saw something colder: finality. By midday, the story had reached a fever pitch. American news networks ran the footage on repeat. British pundits debated whether William's words had broken royal protocol. A former palace insider went on live television to claim that the speech was William's subtle condemnation of the Sussexes' actions since 2020. Every outlet framed it as confrontation. The Sussex team stayed silent, but inside the walls of their home, silence didn't mean calm. Harry spent the afternoon pacing the garden, phone in hand, scrolling through an endless feed of headlines. His friends had started texting him, some sympathetic, some curious. A few advised restraint. "Don't respond," one message read. "He's baiting you." But Harry didn't see it that way. He didn't think William was baiting him. He thought his brother was breaking. He remembered the long nights after their mother's death, the two of them sitting side by side, trying to make sense of a world that suddenly felt cruel and hollow. He remembered promising himself that nothing, no title, no media circus, no expectation, would ever come between them. But promises, he had learned, are fragile things. That night, Harry sat in his study, staring at the muted television. William's image flickered on the screen as news anchors repeated soundbites from the speech. Families fracture in public? The toll of betrayal? The whole world sees our pain. Each phrase landed like a slow echo. He didn't hear his name, but he felt it. Meanwhile, Meghan was already on the phone with their communications advisor. "We're not issuing a statement," she said firmly. "The more we talk, the more they twist it. We stay quiet." The advisor hesitated. "Silence can be taken as guilt." Then let them think what they want, she snapped. We're not feeding this again. But Harry wasn't sure. For years, silence had been his greatest frustration. He had grown up under the rule of never complain, never explain. And yet here they were, being blamed again publicly with no chance to defend themselves. Maybe we should say something, he said quietly after the call ended. Meghan turned to him. And what would we say? That we're sorry for something we didn't do. He didn't answer, because somewhere deep inside, he understood that this wasn't about blame anymore, it was about perception. The narrative had escaped their control a long time ago. Now, even truth itself seemed irrelevant. What mattered was the story the world chose to believe. By evening, the couple's Montecito home was surrounded by news vans parked discreetly on the street outside, their lenses pointed toward the gates. Neighbors complained about the intrusion, but it made little difference. The eyes of the world were back on them, whether they liked it or not. Inside, Harry poured himself a drink and stared out at the Pacific. The water stretched endlessly, calm on the surface, wild beneath. He said our pain was public, he murmured. He's right about that. Meghan joined him by the window, her reflection ghosting beside his in the glass. Do you think he did it for his father? She asked. He nodded slowly. Maybe. Or maybe for himself. Then what happens now? Harry didn't know how to answer. He wanted to call his brother, to say something, anything that could bridge the chasm between them. But too much had been said. Too much left unsaid. Even a phone call now could be twisted into a headline. In London, palace aides were reportedly monitoring California news outlets, taking note of every reaction. Some were relieved by the Sussexes' silence. Others feared it was only temporary. It's always calm before the storm, one staffer remarked grimly. And indeed, within 24 hours, American talk shows began speculating that Meghan might address the issue during her next public appearance. Social media users demanded that Harry speak up. Petitions even appeared online calling for a royal reconciliation, as if peace could be crowdsourced. But inside the Sussex household, peace was nowhere to be found. That night, Harry lay awake, unable to shake the image of his brother's face from his mind. The pain in William's voice had been unmistakable, but so had the accusation. It wasn't just about the monarchy. It was about family, about everything that had been lost between them. He reached for his phone once more, scrolling through the day's coverage, stopping on a photo of William standing before the cameras, head bowed slightly after finishing his speech. For a moment, Harry didn't see the heir to the throne. He saw the boy he used to chase through the gardens of Kensington Palace, the brother who once swore they'd face the world together. And that memory, more than any headline, any speech, any public scrutiny, hurt the most. He turned off the phone and closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Outside, the California waves kept breaking softly against the shore, endless and indifferent, as if to remind him that time moves on even when families do not. By morning, the palace had released a single, understated statement confirming that the Prince of Wales's remarks reflected his deep love for his father and his hope for familial healing. It was a diplomatic attempt to calm the storm, but the damage had already been done. The narrative had taken root. The world had chosen its interpretation. And in Montecito, beneath the California sun, Meghan and Harry found themselves once again in the center of a royal storm they hadn't asked to relive. One that had begun long before that speech, and one that was far from over. For William, those words had been catharsis. For Harry and Meghan, they were a reopening of scars that had never truly healed. And for the monarchy, it was another reminder of its greatest vulnerability, that no crown, no title, no tradition can protect a family from itself. The story of how the House of Windsor reached this moment didn't begin with the abdication announcement or William's trembling speech. It had been building for years, each chapter more turbulent than the last. To understand the chaos that now gripped the monarchy, one had to trace the timeline of its unraveling. From the shimmering spectacle of the 2018 royal wedding to the sharp sting of Megxit in 2020, and every scandal and silence that followed, it was all there. A slow-motion implosion of an institution once thought indestructible. When Meghan Markle first appeared beside Prince Harry, the public was captivated. The media painted her as a breath of fresh air, a modern woman, articulate and independent, stepping into a centuries-old system defined by restraint and tradition. The royal family, for a brief moment, seemed rejuvenated. Crowds cheered, headlines glowed, and commentators spoke of a new era for the monarchy. For a while, it looked like a fairy tale had been restored. But fairy tales don't survive scrutiny. By the end of 2019, cracks began to show. Reports of tension between William and Harry began circulating, first dismissed as tabloid exaggerations, then confirmed by the brothers' own silence. There were whispers of jealousy, of disagreements over roles and responsibilities, of arguments behind palace doors. And then came the bombshell, the announcement that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex would be stepping back from royal duties. No one in the palace was truly prepared for it. The Queen was blindsided, Charles was furious, and William, perhaps more than anyone, was devastated. To him, it wasn't just about duty. It was about betrayal. The monarchy wasn't a job you could quit. It was a lifelong inheritance, a burden shared by blood. In his eyes, Harry hadn't just walked away from the crown, he had walked away from him. From that moment, the dominoes began to fall. The couple's move to North America, the tell-all interview with Oprah Winfrey, the Netflix docuseries, the memoir, all of it tore open old wounds and left new ones bleeding. Every revelation was like a dagger to the institution that thrived on silence. Allegations of racism within the palace, claims of mistreatment, and the couple's assertion that they had been left unsupported all sent shockwaves through the royal establishment. For the monarchy, the narrative of dignity and duty was replaced by one of dysfunction and distrust. Behind closed doors, King Charles had tried to maintain balance. He reached out privately, attempting to repair what had been broken, but years of resentment and media warfare had taken their toll. Harry's relationship with his father, once complicated but affectionate, became distant. Charles had spent decades living under the shadow of scandal. His failed marriage, his affair, his public unpopularity. And the one thing he had hoped to restore through his reign was stability. Instead, he found himself presiding over a divided family and a skeptical public. By 2022, after the Queen's passing, Charles's reign began under a cloud of quiet doubt. The public mourned the Queen deeply but regarded her successor with reserved patience. He was dutiful but not beloved. His speeches were eloquent, his demeanor calm, but beneath the surface, the family fractures continued to haunt him. Every attempt to project unity, a balcony appearance, a holiday photo, a family gathering, felt forced, like actors performing a play everyone knew the ending to. For William, these years were a test of endurance. He had tried to be the peacemaker, the protector of his father's legacy, but each new interview from the Sussexes chipped away at his resolve. When Harry's memoir hit the shelves, filled with raw confessions and stinging criticism of the royal institution, William's restraint finally began to falter. The press captured none of it, but those close to him said that night, after reading certain passages, he threw the book across the room. By then, his trust in his brother was gone. And yet, deep down, there was still love, buried, bruised, but not extinguished. That contradiction tormented him more than anger ever could. How could he hate the person who shared his grief, his childhood, his mother's laughter? But how could he forgive the man who had turned that shared history into global entertainment? Meanwhile, public opinion swung like a pendulum. Some viewed Harry and Meghan as brave truth-tellers exposing an outdated system. Others saw them as opportunists cashing in on family pain. The polarization was complete. The monarchy had become less a symbol of unity and more a mirror of division, reflecting the fractures of a society that had once looked to it for steadiness. When Charles ascended the throne, he knew the cracks couldn't be hidden forever. "We are not what we once were," he reportedly told a close aide. "We are a family trying to survive our own story."